Good evening, and welcome to the Museum of Modern Art. My name is Pablo Helguera, and I'm the Director of Adult and Academic Programs in the Education Department at MoMA. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the first program of our One Work conversation series featuring the artist Jackie Winsor. As part of our efforts to celebrate the reopening of MoMA and its reimagined galleries, this conversation series has been established to introduce and reintroduce the public to key, specific, and remarkable works in the collection by hearing directly from the artist about its making, the set of concerns that inform it, and its place within its artistic and their artistic trajectory. Since the late 1960s, Jackie Winsor has been making sculpture that expands a minimalist vocabulary of simple geometric forms, using unrefined materials and grids to investigate ideas about process and labor. Working by hand and spending years on some pieces, Winsor produces intimate, tactile sculptures that call attention to a complex relationship between interior and exterior. Her early pieces included columns of coiled rope and bound wood trunks. Later, she began to work with burnt, dried, or exploded cubes of wood and cement. In the 1980s, her work turned to polished cement spheres and mirrored cubes with apertures that allowed the eye to peer inside and find finely crafted and colored interiors. Winsor has had an extensive and celebrated international exhibition career. This includes a mid-career retrospective of her work at MoMA in 1979. This was the first time that MoMA presented a retrospective of the work of a woman artist since 1946. Other exhibitions include American Woman Artists Show at the Kunsthaus Hamburg in Germany, 26 Contemporary Women Artists at the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art, curated by Lucy Lippard, and Jackie Winsor with and Within 2014 exhibition, also at the Aldrich. The format of this education program series is intentionally compact and dynamic. We will keep the program at 1 hour, no less and no more. And we really encourage you to think about questions for the artist. So start thinking your ideas and your questions now. At the end of the program, we invite you to go into the museum galleries to take a look at the work being discussed and enjoy it in person. I want to thank the artist for being with us and accepting our invitation. I also want to thank my colleagues, Jess Van Nostrand and Adelia Gregory from the Adult and Academic Programs Department for their expert organizing of this program, to our intern Eleni Riga for her support, to Emily Cushman from the Department of Drawing and Prints, and last but not least, my sincere thanks to Christophe Cherix, the Robert Lehman Foundation Chief Curator of Drawings and Prints, for moderating tonight's conversation. Thank you, and now, without any further ado, help me in welcoming Christophe and Jackie Winsor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and thank you to all your team in education to make this program happen. It's very exciting for curators to be able to talk about works that often came recently to the collection or haven't been on view for a long time. And if you go through the galleries, you'll see that almost 40% of the works on display So 4 out of 10 are either work that we recently acquire or work that haven't been shown for more than 20 years. So this program really allows to be very specific on a work. And the one we want to discuss today is a work that just came to our collection in the spring, thanks to the generosity of Alice and Tom Tisch. And I'm very grateful to you, Jackie, for being with us, because it will allow us to better understand this work in relation to the other sculpture we have in the collection. We have 3 magnificent works from the 70s, but this is the earliest one, so it allows us to talk a little bit about how you began and how that already announced some of the works to come. So we're going to talk about chunk piece and only chunk piece almost tonight. But for those of you who haven't seen it on view, I urge you to go after the program. That's why we try to keep it exactly to the hour on the 4th floor gallery in a beautiful space that we call the sculpture platform, which open on the sculpture garden. And you'll see the piece that we're going to discuss today, chunk piece, in relation to other work from the 70s. We have a beautiful new installation by Barbara Chase-Ribou, a great sculpture in 4 part by Linda Benglis, a hanging work by Louise Bourgeois, the Lynch fragment by Mel Edwards. So artists who try in the 70s to rethink what sculpture is and paradoxically to reappropriate some very traditional modes of making a sculpture, some metal casts that we hadn't seen for a long time before that, or to be, as is, I think, Jackie, very hands-on with sculpture. So really where time, duration really plays a very important part. So one of the things that excited us very much for this work to come to the collection is its material. It's made of hemp, it's made of rope. And for good or bad reason, I don't know, you'll tell us, Jackie, your work often has been associated with the use of that material. Even in fact, you use it just for a few years. After chunk piece and a few other, it's almost gone, or you're going to use it in relationship to other material. But hemp and rope seems to have been very much associated with your practice as a sculptor. And so my first question to you is like, how did that come about? Why is this material? Can you tell us a little bit about when you discovered it and why you thought it would be maybe an interesting thing to add to your vocabulary at the time?
Well, it seems to me nothing starts at a given moment, right? It has a background. And my background before this piece was that I was very interested in drawing. And I mean, it's only a couple years before this that I was in graduate school. And I got a degree in drawing and painting, and I didn't do much of either. But anyway, so I was interested in line and what it does. And so during that period of time when I was there, it was mostly just trying to figure out how to make a piece. And where I went with that was making pieces and using polyester resin. And polyester resin is very toxic. And one day I went up to this shape that I had cast, and I sanded it for about, half hour or so. And after having slept 8 hours the night before, I went back and slept 12 hours afterwards. And I thought, well, this is not good for you. I have to stop using this. And so I finished off what I was doing, but I just told myself I'd give myself a year to come up with something that I liked, right? So I spent my first year in New York just looking around for things. And when as I said, I had this real drawing sense, and and I was a painter and color and all that. And so what I came across was mountain climbing rope. And mountain climbing rope has this central core with 4 coils that go around it, and it has a little color thread going through it telling you how strong it is. And if one of the pieces gets worn away, you still have that center column. And so I thought, well, I can use this, right? So I use that in my studio, and ran out, and so I found out a place that I could get some more, and I went there. And when I got there, you know, young lady in wanting sculpture materials, and the guy figured out he had this thing in his back room that he's trying to get rid of, and he said to me, well, I have something you're going to love, right? And I said, oh, great. And he brought me in the back, and what he had was a great big mound of 4-inch rope, and it had been, he told me it was a movie star. It had been on the waterfront, this mound, and and so I got it for next to nothing. I just had to drag it to my studio. Well, you know, I had it there for about a year, you know, tucked away over there, and then I needed to do something there, and I dragged it over there, and after doing from corner to corner and dragging it around, finally I figured out what I could do with it. And it sort of grew on me, and what grew on me about it is that it was very much like a drawing, all these lines. So there's like 3 twists there, and each one has about 300 threads in it, and so it was very much like drawing. It's this very long thread, and when it's twisted, it looks very much like, you know, a bicep, and so it really interested me what it looked like, and so that's how it came into my life, right?
And did it resonate in any way with you coming from St. John's in Newfoundland? Like, because rope was also used to tie ships to docks, and I was wondering if there was an echo to those early years you spent away from New York.
Well, I suppose I didn't see any big ships that had 4-inch rope on it. And I left when I was 4.5. Right? So, but I lived on the ocean, like we live on the ocean here, right? But I also don't see the ocean here, right?
That's right.
So I wouldn't say there's anything direct that way about it, but the most direct thing, I suppose, is that I have been very physical, right? I used to walk and run and do gymnastics and all that. And so the physicalness of it is what appealed to me. And now I know the connection was made, but these are other people's connections rather than my own. And so no, I just like the physicality.
And could you talk a little bit how you made that work? Because it's, when you look at it first, it's striking because it's just on the floor. It's a quite heavy work. And it's exactly what its title is. I think you call the title almost a nickname. So it's a chunk of ropes which are kind of bundled together. And how did you come about with that shape? It's a rope which kind of self-generated a larger shape?
Well, the thing is, you know, this happens, and then that happens, and the next thing happens, and after a while you get to that. And there's a long continuum in it. And among the things were, you know, when I had to give up using polyester resin, and I made it with plaster in it, and it looked like granite, right? And I thought that was such a beautiful material. Well, so, you know, it's a big adjustment to shift over to something else, and you're just trying to get to know the material, right? And just as and I made pieces, right? And they had to do with various things. But among my first studio in New York was on Canal and Mulberry, and there's a truck route from Brooklyn to the Holland Tunnel, and vibrating all the time. And the second place I had was a canal right at the foot of the bridge, right? And they'll shake, shake, shake. And so the first things I made went up, and a month or 2 months later, they're on the floor, right? And this happened over and over again, right? And then, so, you know, I took my clues from what was happening, and then I started making things that were on the floor, right? And then in that period of time where I was making those early pieces, you know, I didn't know. What do you know, right? I went going to get some more rope, and I found out after a while that they stopped making that rope, and it was being replaced with synthetic rope. And so, hey, that was all I had, the amount I had, right? And so, then you have to figure out what you're going to do from there, right? And so, among the things that I thought that I would do is, you know, as an in-between, Among the in-between pieces I made is another piece that you have with a four-corner one.
That's right.
Right, where I undid the rope and bound it around some logs. And the other was to cut it and make a big version of a small piece. If you had a piece this big, this is just blown up like this big, right? And so I was taking qualities that I liked in what I used in it originally and moved forward.
So that piece seems also, at least in my mind, to relate to another work that you made a few months before that. And it's kind of an unusual work for you because it's a performance that took place in a space downtown named 112 Green Street, so a big loft on Green Street, which opened the same year you made that performance in 1970, and was an important alternative space for works which were really neither sculpture or choreography, but a little bit in between. I mean, artists like Gordon Matterclark made a lot of works there. And you told me that you were asked to make a performance in a series at the occasion of an exhibition that would bring together precisely artists who usually didn't make performance.
Well, it was precisely that, if you absolutely didn't, right? But so I didn't know what to do, but getting the rope, I had a studio that was very tiny. It was a little wedge that wasn't much bigger than this here, but I had 4 floors and above the store level. And so when I got this big chunk of rope, there you see, I dragged it up to a little landing, and then I dragged up the second floor, and I dragged up the next landing, and dragged up, and you pull it, and it's dead weight, and it's and so after a while, I would pull up this landing up to that landing, get some more, go up to that landing, up, and then some more onward. All day long it took me to get it up. But somewhere, around floor 3 or 4, some of the rope toppled over and pulled me down to the landing below, and that seemed to have great incentive for the dream I had that night, which was that it took over and buried me, and nobody could find me.
Under the rope. Under the rope.
That was a dream. Oh, God. Anyway, so when they asked me to do this, I said, well, I'll just do my dream. And so we dragged the rope over, and I made a little hole in the floor between the ground level and the basement level. And we threaded it up, and the piece was taking it up through onto the floor, just pulling it up and pulling it up like I did, right? And I had somebody at the lower level, and after we got the mound up, a little past, then we let it down again, and it went over the woman, right? And so the mound all came down, it was over her. And then somebody else had a piece, and their piece was smoke machines all over the place, and smoke machines, it all goes down, right? And it went down to the lower level, and this lady was down underneath this mound, said, "Get me out of here," right? And so I thought, well, that was perfect. It wasn't planned, but that was exactly what I thought. And anyway, and well, then it went home, and I did use it for that other piece that you had a photograph of.
And as you were explaining this piece, I was thinking about another interest of you for its dance and choreography and the work of peers of yours of your generation, Trisha Brown and Yvonne Reiner and so on. How do you connect the two, the sculpture in space and the body in space? You talk about chunk as a muscle.
Well, among the things that I liked when I first came, the whole area was sort of becoming abandoned, and spaces didn't have any particular value. And so 112 Green Street, you could just go and do a performance. But there were lots of, Yvonne Reiner's Grand Union performers were around. I loved them. I went to just about everything that she did. She had a piece that was called The Mind is a Muscle, my favorite. Anyway, so it seemed to me her sensibility was similar to my sensibility. She made different things than I made, right? But in the end, as a result of my going to so many of those performances, I live in a building that's all of Yvonne's Grand Union performers are in that building. But it's more about a kindredness of interest that was there, and it was very active at that time in the neighborhood.
And for me, that performance and precisely your interest to other modes of expression allowed your sculpture to develop in a very interesting way. And before Chunk, there is this work, double bound circle.
Well, yeah, this one was before the Chunk piece,
Just
right?
and you see on the left that's come from the Avalanche archive that we have at the museum, and we see the two together like this kind of loose rope. And the work being made. Could you talk a little bit about how one became the other and how that piece was originated?
Well, I mean, that's exactly the rope that I dragged 5 flights up. That was, my studio was on the 5th floor, right? So I was pretty strong at that point, and, you know, and that's what it was for, right? Mm-hmm. There was another chunk, and the other chunk got to be the one for the performance that I did. But that was originally what I got the rope for, to build a couple of these pieces.
That sculpture.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's few of the work that you make in the years to follow, just to show that you don't abandon hemp, but often you combine it with other materials in the following years. And we have here on the left like plywood scare, which is, you told me it's a piece of very thin plywood
right,
and covered
here,
with
right.
hemp.
Well, what I became aware of my interest was that I was more interested in solids, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the
self-contained volumes.
Well, they're a solid volume of the material, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, you know, things change, you move on to something else. And so I was interested in changing one shape into another shape, right? And so I had this, you know, 3/4 inch plywood, 4x4, half a sheet. And I had about 500 pounds of rope that I unraveled. And, you know, wrap it this way, wrap, and wrap. And more wrapping, right? Took a long time, and there's a lot of rope. And so it makes this shape that, you know, a little pot belly on the middle, and it has a little curve in the edges, a slight curve. And the rope creates the shape, and as it builds up, as it crosses over, and it makes that kind of swollen shape. And so, so I was interested in going from that flat little, you know, boring plywood to a, you know, kind of, very presence, full of a lot of presence in it. And, you know, this one here is very similar. Made a little cylinder of, you know, just little twiggies that were around in the area, and uses copper to wrap it into a big swollen shape.
So in all those work, it seems time take an important it's an important factor. They take times to be realized, and I wanted to jump to the exhibition you had at the Museum of Modern Art in 1979, because when I talked about Chunk piece being here, in fact, it's Chunk piece coming back to us because it was first shown here in a survey exhibition you had. And I looked at, and you have here a view of I'll show you other shots of that exhibition. And I thought, and I looked at those shots after installing Chunk on the 4th floor, and I realized that we position it the same way, like by the window.
Right.
On a different floor, now it's looking down. Here you are more like on the ground floor, and you see on that shot that it's really connected to another work, which is, it seems that the exhibition was overflowing the garden itself. You know, you have this brick and cement piece, which is next to it. And I looked at the catalog that was produced at the occasion. The show was curated by Kineston McShine, one of our great curators. And Kineston, the first sentence, and Kineston was a man of few words, but you feel a great admiration. He said something like, Jackie Winsor in the last decades has produced only 40 works. And dot. Like just the idea that duration and time and the pacing of the work was maybe part of your practice seems to have deeply impressed him. And that exhibition brings together 24 pieces. So I feel there is something very interesting for very young artists who had a first show just a few years before at Paula Cooper Gallery, and Paula is with us. Thank you for all your help for tonight. Suddenly coming with an exhibition which has, half of the work that she has ever made. So I wanted to know a little bit about the making of that exhibition and also the installation of that exhibition. Because when I look at those pictures, what I found fascinating, you have so many works close to each other, creating like a tension, a relationship between volumes and objects that is quite different the way we would install sculpture today.
That's a lot. What was the simple question?
The simple question is like, how does the exhibition come about?
Oh.
And how do you think about the installation of the show?
One of the big interests I have in my pieces is that they pull energy into themselves. They're very self-contained. And part of all that time and concern and care in doing them, they seem to hold time in themselves, and they're not hermetically sealed or anything, but they hold their own space, and they sort of emanate out in holding their space. And so, they're their own piece, right? They don't depend on anything else, and so they can be in the space together, and they don't overly impact the other ones, right? And I like them like that, right?
I think it's very beautiful. And in the catalog also there's a very nice text by Ellen Johnson. And she compares some of your work or your sculpture to Cézanne's apples. There's the idea that those objects are kind of stubborn. They just exist on their own. They exist only through the light that, hit them. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect, about the work existing, And she talks also a lot about Cézanne painting a portrait in 11 or 120 sittings, and how much time and duration become part of the work itself.
Well, I think like the little apple that she compared it with, right? So the interest, it seemed to be, and the comparison interest, was that because it's made over time, it's not like a gesture in time like this. It's many, many, many gestures, and just like the light on the apple, right? It was a photograph of an apple in many different daytimes parted. So that it isn't like, 1 p.m., 2 p.m. It is that, but it's also 5 p.m. and, onward, and they're all there, so it has that little vibration of all of the day in the light that's merged together in it. And I had made a piece that's sort of big, fat corners on it, right? And so it also had that thing that it's a little bit of this, it's a little bit as the shape swells out, and that one little 4 logs together, and I built the forms out so they filled the center in, and there was 4 of them pushed together. So they had that. They had, and I did it over about 6 months, right? And so it contains that. It has a sense of time in it, and I think that's what she was talking about with the apple.
And one work follows the next, or do you work on many sculptures at the same time?
They take a lot of time. I mean, there's one piece in there, I don't know. Oh, yes, that little one up there, that little long one. I nailed pieces of wood together with lots and lots and lots of nails, and I would just hammer on that till I hit a thumb or something, and then I quit for the day, and then come back, and I, do it. And, I mean, it's focused on one piece. I hardly ever worked on more in those days, right?
And do you have any recollection of the installation itself?
I know you have this slide there, but the very first, when I was first making sculpture, this one here, what I did is I didn't know how to make sculpture because I was a painter and drawing. And so what I did is I made the shape I wanted to make big, and so I made them small. Then I could figure out how to do it big, right? And so I installed them on this piece of, reddish wood, and they're floating. You can see a little shadow around the edge. They're floating on a plexi surface. And so and it's not so different than how they're installed. And they're all, again, so into themselves that they just share the space comfortably. And, but basically when I did that, I did it to figure out how to make it bigger. And I had to invent some version of carpentry to figure out how to make it big. But that's how come that was made.
It's kind of fascinating to see that already, like in your thesis exhibition at Rutgers, like with a floor plan of an exhibition is going to happen, like 12 years later, but with a fully realized object. It took you 12 years, but you actually realize each of them.
But the other one up there, I think that one had to do with things that I sort of made a little bit later. And that is, one piece that I made was, I made it into a cube of plywood, right? And it was made around a little empty square on the center, but it was like about this thick of plywood. And I burned it into a sphere. And basically, it was making two shapes come together, and the staticness of the cube and the kind of ness of the into this sort of glorious sphere, right, with little apertures in it. But this was sort of like the first where I tried to get a dome and square together by halving things. That's as far as I got with it. But it was this impulse was there from the very beginning.
To keep that impulse, we'll talk a little bit about more cubes later on, but first I'd like to pause to see if we have at that point any questions from the public. I think there's a couple of microphones on each side. I'm sure you have at least one question. If you have a question, just raise your because I want you to have a microphone, because as it's just make sure people understand everything.
So very early in the slide presentation, on the left side, there was a square that was taller in the middle, and it seemed wrapped in two directions. Yes.
That? Yeah.
Yes. There is no way that piece could be considered to be a product of the ordinary world. There's something transformative about it. But somebody could make it into something they could sell, some sort of home object. So as a way of protecting its artistic force, merit, value, what do you think about the idea of something like that being secured within the walls of a museum and not shown elsewhere? Not become confused with something that belongs in the common sphere.
Well, your artwork is, they're always in some way a self-portrait. You have a huge identification with this little product, right, that you have there. And it was never intended out there, and, it's in a very physical way. It's an introspective object, right? And so there's lots of things out there in the world that you can do to take care of your needs, like mops and things like that, but there was no need. And as a matter of fact, early on, I had somebody wanted to buy a piece, and what they told me they wanted to do with it is put a piece of glass over and have it as a coffee table. And I was so insulted. Anyway, I started using a contract to inhibit such behavior. And because they were buying it for next to nothing. Most of those pieces sold for very little. And very often my rent for that period of time exceeded what I got from selling them. So I wanted to make sure they were thought about the way I thought about it. So I used the contract, and I probably ruined a few years of Paula's life, and I know my own. But so yeah, I did that, and my main feeling about it is that I just didn't want to feel badly about my work, what happened to it. I just wanted to abandon it out, out there. And so I used the contract, and in the end, when the value of the pieces got to be big enough, people wouldn't do that. But as long as they were selling at bargain prices, you just needed to inhibit their behavior. And so I used a contract. So there were sales that didn't happen, and in the end, there was a sort of backdoor kind of policy that if they gave it to a museum, well, there was no, everything else got surrendered. And so they didn't go off and become somebody's coffee table.
So you protected your perception of the piece by having that restriction?
Well, I protected the intent.
Thank you.
Do we have another question? Emily, maybe just for the front row.
Over here.
You mentioned that you trained as a draftsman and painter. Do you still do either of those? And when you're planning your sculptures, do you take the time to sit down beforehand and plan them out and draw them out? Or is it more of a kind of spontaneous action?
Well, life changes, you move on. Mostly what I do is I test everything. I have a zillion tests that I do. I test the materials till I get them, in the area that I want them. I test this, I test that, onward, and I end up selecting one, and then I have a pile of all the other stuff over there. No, but I think the drawing is in the pieces, right? I was a painter and I drew, right? And look at that. It's just nothing but lines. It's my three-dimensional drawing, right? Round, right? I got nice and plump in them. And the same here, right? There's an awful lot about drawing in it. And so I feel it's covered. And there are a number of them. I made, Paula was asking about drawings once, and I ended up making this piece that's just, 7 or 8 layers of mesh, and you can slightly see through it, if you go up like this. And so it's like crosshatch, right, and into a shape. So I think those things are there. And when I was selecting the rope, the different ropes that I used, I chose them for their color or how well the shapes were, pristine or beat up or whatnot. There was one piece that was black and all chewed up, and I used that for one thing, and another one had that very pristine kind of yellowish color that the rope is when it's more new. And so I feel like it's all there. And so using the concrete in some of the pieces that I've used more recently, I've tested them to death, right, to get something. And because I've mixed color with the concrete, it's a foreign matter, and concrete doesn't like it, so it weakens it in some cases and whatnot. So I'd always test to see where I got the best strength and the best color and surface and things like that. And so it's all in there, you see. 3 for the price of 1. So, yes.
Your materials are so natural, and there's, they're really, in a way, what we today almost view as old-fashioned materials. And we hear so much about technology and how that's changed, whether it's, anything from 3D printing or new materials that you see in a pair of sneakers that you can't believe it's something that, would have put man on the moon way back. And I'm curious how you think about conservation of your own materials, and whether you think about some of the newer materials integrating into them, or you really feel wedded to these historic You know, how far forward would you go in your thinking?
Well, probably about a foot ahead of me, right? You know what I mean? Certain things scale the piece, right? And these little threads are like a sort of baby finger size, and they scale it, and they're all pretty much scaled to the body, right? Now, if I ran into something that did things that I like, I have no objection to what's out there. It's just I wanted to relate over here. And a lot of new materials, they're all about making no seams, no anything, so color or surface. And that seems good for people who like it, but it isn't my interest. And so, yeah, it's simply if it comes in the range of my interest, you know. And I like things that relate to the human body, right? So they're sort of a little bit bigger, a little bit sort of in here, right? And so the timing of your body and what you do with your body, your capacities and your sense of fullness and things like that, they're all in there. Now, people making pieces that are more related to architecture, right? Well, that's their work, right? They're up to, you know, whatever. It's just not necessarily interest of mine. When we were talking earlier, I had a show out at PS1, and PS1 was something in another century or so ago. And the pieces felt very comfortable there because that century was making things that was a very comfortable relationship with people in it to go to school because it was PS1. You know what I mean? And so and that's the interest. And what else can I say?
We will take one more question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk so far. I've been thinking a lot about the embeddedness of some of the materials that you're working with. So the line or the thread that's embedded in the cylinder in chunk piece, or the cube that's embedded in the sphere. I'm just wondering like how that came about, how you started to work with kind of, yeah, nesting or conjoining different shapes or materials together with one another.
Well, as I said, I ran out of rope. And so I transitioned, right? Had to do something, right? And so, like, one other piece this here is the burn piece. Well, by the time I got around to making that, I'd made about 3 or 4, you know, before that. And where I got in making the pieces, because of those round rope coiled ones, I was interested in the integrity of like what was there, that it was solid and in place and there. Well, and I was also interested in that center empty space being captured as part of the piece. And there were other pieces that I also, that was there. And the earliest cube piece I made, it was really containing a little empty space and a little bit of light that came through in it. And, you know, I lived in a very noisy, shaky area, and the sheetrock was that thick, so it sort of set aside a quiet spot, right? And, but by the time I got to making that piece, I was interested in a kind of silent partner, right? You know, that is there in the final thing, but mostly you don't see it. And I put, you know, I made the piece. I had some slides of it, but somehow they didn't get here. But anyway, the construction of the cube was made to withstand huge amount of stress, right? And but basically, what I wanted is to bring an unknown force or energy and this solid, clunky cube right together to create, you know, singular in the end. And the unknown or the singular, it was putting the fire in it and making the fire sort of do the drawing on the surface and the inside and whatnot. And so I got interested for a while. It was similar to wanting those empty spaces be as important as the shapes that went around them. But this, as I said, I went with fire, and the fires became very dominant in it. But basically, it was wanting to get the known and the unknown together and see if they could hold it together in the end. And, it's hang out with yourself too long, you can't imagine what you think.
So speaking of burn cube, we have a little clip to show you. We wanted to illustrate that with a film that Jackie reminded me that we had in the collection, and it's a 45-minute film, so you just have a 1-minute fragment of it. So I wanted us to talk a little bit about Burn Peace, which is another work from our collection, which was also, as we saw in the 1979 exhibition, which also relate to performance, but a different kind of performance. And as you know, in the new model or the new way we envision the galleries going forward, we wish to rotate the works as often as we can, just to show the depth and this, the diversity of a practice. And our intent is to show burn piece where chunk piece is. So if you come back in a few months, you'll see that work, which was made 7 or 8 years after. Would you talk a little bit about the process leading to that piece? It's different material, cement and burnt wood. How did that come about, and how did the process allow you to rethink a little bit the role of sculpture?
Well, I have a bit of an engineering way of thinking, right? I like to go step by step by step by step, right? And so I knew that the cement would be utterly and completely stressed with what I was making. So I went up to Alfred, it's a ceramic school, and I asked them all what they suggested. And basically, they suggested it wasn't a good idea. And so then I said, well, it's really most like a house burning down. So I went to the fire department, and I asked them, and they basically said the same thing. It's not a great idea. Anyway, so I knew enough about those things myself. I mean, it wasn't technical, really technical, but I knew enough. And I know there's a thing called grog, that's a pre-fired clay, and what you do if you're going to build some big ceramic sculpture, you put this stuff in it, and it's fired at a higher temperature than what you will fire the other part, so it can hold shape if it goes to melt. So instead of putting sand in the mix of concrete over there, I put this pre-fired clay in it. And that was one thing. And on the other, I said I had the slides, but I don't anymore. But anyway, so what I did is I built the corners, so they were like 4 by 4, like that, empty. And I had reinforced things inside of that there, and I had reinforced wires and whatnot in there to hold the concrete together in the stress. So it has a stronger frame, and you can see some of the areas there where it changes. You get sort of vertical dark spots, and the center the outside and the inside, horizontal lath held the concrete, but actually it had very thick frame inside on these corners there, and the combination of those two things, I figured it would withstand the fire. And then I let it dry for a year, and so there wouldn't be very much moisture in it. So basically what I was trying to do is to, the force of the fire, I was trying to make the strength of the concrete. But the thing is, I wanted it to be the known and the unknown, and I immediately went to the buffering up the unknown part and making it more known, but it made it through the fire actually quite well. It did expand, fire makes it expand a little bit, and then when it started cooling, it did contract, so made little cracks here and there that you can see in it. But as I said, I wanted the engagement between the two things to be sort of what was the piece. And, all those marks are all made by fire. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
So another question I had is about your work today. What are you thinking about today? How is your work as sculptor is evolving? And when we talked a little bit about that last week, you mentioned still the interest for the cube and those volumes, right, but also the idea to inset them in the wall.
Right. Well, so these, seem a million miles away from what we just saw, right? But what I was interested in, and have been with those was stillness and movement, and the center area, which looks like just a complete flat extension of what goes on in the concrete around the edge. But actually it's about, 6 or 7 layers of plexi that have the same thing on each one, so they're lined up perfectly. And when you move to the side, it starts showing depth, and it moves as you walk by it. You can see it makes it more dimensional looking. So I was interested in this very still, static thing, that it has surprises within it as you moved around or as you saw it from the side a bit. It isn't quite as clear as I'd like, but it's the slide I had. But anyway, so something could go 1 minute be like this, and then you can see the depth that's in it, and that it pulls you in with that depth. So it's kind of motion and slowness, and in some other ways with other pieces, there's, a lot of pieces in between. One of the things I was doing, I did somewhere in the 80s, was I made a piece that was all plaster, and I layered it in, right? Started out here, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's about 13 layers of 1/4 inch plaster on all surfaces. And then when I got it, enough in there, then I forced it apart, right? I put, 4x4 in it and a wedge and just banged it so it pulled it apart at the seams. And I turned the whole piece inside out. So the inside, which in that case was the last layer on the inside was yellow, I pulled it apart so it had little pyramids on all sides. So it was, so it was a different way of transforming just a plain old cube into this very sort of ziggurat-y looking thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so movement and stillness and how it changes things, and they continue to be.
And they're all very much qualities that we found in chunk piece too. I think when you just look at right. Chunk piece, it has this stillness, it has this capacity to, every time you look at it, if you go around it, to change as you walk around it. So thank you so much for allowing us to go both backward and forward in your work. I don't think we look at chunk piece the same way that we have in the past. And we'll have you again for burn piece in the gallery, I hope.
Right.
Thank you.